English-speaking regions of Cameroon have for decades complained of marginalization, particularly in education and legal systems, by the Francophone-dominated government. These grievances have triggered widespread protests and violence since October 2016. Over the past few months, there has been an alarming spike in attacks on schools and education centers in the north and southwest of Cameroon. In one such incident last October, at least 8 children were killed and a dozen wounded after attackers stormed a school in Kumba. One of the affected parents speaks out on the death of her daughter.
My heart bleeds a lot because her death was so tragic. She went through a lot of pain.
We want peace, no more killing.
Hello, I'm Mubarak Kenyam, and welcome to this week's edition of Africa Today, which is focusing on the Anglophone crisis in Cameroon. We are discussing the underlying reasons for violence, which continues to impact negatively on lives of people in the region. In the second part of our program, we shall be talking about the impact of Brexit on Africa and how Britain is undermining regional economic blocs in Africa in pursuit of its economic interests.
Cameroon's Anglophone Crisis. Cameroon, a former German colony, was divided between the Allied French and British victors at the end of World War I. In 1960, France granted independence to its colony. Britain, however, had a different proposition. A United Nations referendum was held in British Cameroons on 11th of February 1961 to determine whether the territory should join neighboring Cameroon or Nigeria. The Anglophone Cameroonians who opted in that referendum to form a federation with French Cameroon. However, they have since felt increasingly marginalized by the French-speaking government in Yaoundé, hundreds of miles away. In October 2017, militant secessionist groups symbolically proclaimed the independence of a new nation. In these 4 years, clashes between the Cameroon military and separatist fighters have led to over 3,000 deaths and many displaced persons. People in the English-speaking regions have often claimed they are being unfairly treated by Paul Biya's French-centered government. Biya has been Cameroon's president since 1982.
In June 2020, the Norwegian Refugee Council declared the conflict in Cameroon as the most neglected crisis on the planet for a second year running. Opposition leaders are blaming the government for imposing a military solution to a political problem.
This crisis is a political one, and we expect the government to address a political solution to it. As of now, we are seeing that a military solution that is being given to a political crisis.
Now, for more analysis on the protracted Anglophone crisis in Cameroon, we contacted Kawala, the president of the Cameroon People's Party. She's an entrepreneur and social activist who was a presidential candidate back in 2011. Thanks, madam, for your time. Now, as we know, the Anglophone crisis, which is a relic of colonialism, has led to pain and suffering in Cameroon. Now, what is really happening?
This problem is 60 years old, and today the result is over 4,000 people who have been killed, close to 1 million people, so 700,000 and more are internally displaced in Cameroon. About 60,000 are refugees in neighboring Nigeria. We have over 600,000 children whose schooling has been compromised. Every single day in Cameroon, somebody is being killed in the Anglophone regions. And very, very often, this includes the civilians. So more than 50% of those who are killed are civilians, and women and children.
Thanks for that, Ms. Wala, the president of Cameroon's People's Party.
France, which has significant business interests in its former colony, has been careful not to overly criticize the government's handling of the crisis. Human rights advocates and scholars have blamed French President Emmanuel Macron for providing military and political support to the Paul Biya regime that is suppressing the English-speaking regions.
The Cameroon Anglophone crisis has been described by some analysts as Rwanda in slow motion, a reference to the genocide that occurred in Rwanda in 1994 when nearly 1 million people, most of them from the Tutsi minority group, were slaughtered by Hutu extremists in a space of a few months. Now, France is accused of having assisted the perpetrators of the Rwanda genocide and is now facing similar accusations in Cameroon. Ms. Wala, are the former colonial powers, especially France, involved in any way in fomenting the crisis in Cameroon?
France especially, so when the British left, they left. They have very few economic interests in Cameroon. They have very, very little political influence over Cameroon. But the French remained a very strong partner of Cameroon. And throughout our history, the French have been, they have never favored the Anglophone part of the country being fully integrated into the country. They had a kind of fear and a kind of rejection of the Anglophones. So today, the French are perceived as an ally of a very dictatorial government that we have.
In 2019, President Paul Biya called for national dialogue in a bid to put an end to the conflict between security forces and armed separatists from the Anglophone minority. However, the dialogue process failed to halt the violence. Addressing the nation on 31st of December last year, President Biya said his government has continued to demonstrate its commitment to openness and dialogue.
Our government has continued to demonstrate its commitment to openness and dialogue by, for example, releasing many former secessionists and facilitating their reintegration into society. Furthermore, after the major national dialogue, the government fast-tracked the implementation of an ambitious decentralization policy, which includes a special status for our northwest and southwest regions, which takes into account their specificities and aspirations.
The government says it is committed to dialogue. What was the outcome of the dialogue between the government and the secessionists in Cameroon?
The secessionists, who are, the armed group on the ground, were not present in the dialogue as a movement. There were some individuals there who claimed that they used to be armed fighters who had put down their guns, but they were not there to speak in the name of this movement. So this was not a dialogue that you could speak of. You could not see two parties clearly represented. You could not see a neutral facilitator that had credibility with the different warring factions. It was a farce organized by the government to sort of tick the box and to sort of get people off their backs because there had been such a strong demand for dialogue.
Thousands of small-scale farmers in Cameroon's English-speaking southwest and northwest regions have been forced off their land by armed conflict between government forces and Anglophone separatists. Now, how has the Anglophone crisis impacted on Cameroon's economy, especially the affected regions?
A war economy has installed itself in these two regions. So the population and especially economic actors are being extorted both by the armed groups and by the army. And so you find that people, to be able to get out their agricultural produce, to be able to get out their merchandise, are having to pay to whoever is controlling, whichever person with a gun is controlling that part of the armed, that part of the territory. The other thing is that smuggling has greatly increased. The economic effects of this, the social effects of this are devastating.
Thanks, Ms. Wala, for that insight. Now, are regional bodies such as ECOWAS and the African Union playing an active role in ending the Anglophone crisis in Cameroon?
At this time, it's very unclear for us whether the African Union does not see this as a priority crisis, does not see all of these people dying as being a matter of extreme urgency. For us as Cameroonians, it is a matter of extreme urgency as we lose people every single day. The deaths are horrific. The violence, including gender-based violence against women, we have children dying in this conflict. We are not seeing the support other African countries and from the African Union that we would have hoped to get.
Well, we do hope that the African Union will take action and resolve the neglected Anglophone crisis in Cameroon for peace and prosperity to return.
Brexit's impact on Africa.
Britain exited the European Union on the 31st January 2020. The status of Britain's relationship with the European Union following the end of the transition period on the 31st December 2020 remains uncertain. This ambiguity extends to the political and economic trading relationships that Britain is having with non-EU countries, including African countries.
During the inaugural 2020 UK-Africa Summit, British Prime Minister Boris Johnson said his country had all it took to become Africa's obvious partner of choice for doing business post-Brexit, when it was no longer tethered to European Union trade agreements with the continent. However, the summit was not welcomed by many. Demonstrators and activists gathered outside the venue in London to express their opposition to this summit.
The UK-Africa Forum has been held in London, with the UK government hosting business leaders to discuss future investment in Britain. The event was attended by business leaders who rubbed shoulders with around 20 African heads of state. The event was also attended by Prince Harry, with UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson also present in order to give a keynote speech. Activists outside the prestigious venue, however, made their views known about why they had decided to oppose the forum and everything it represented.
During the summit, Johnson appeared to be on an aggressive campaign to dump Britain's consumer products in Africa. One of Britain's plans includes selling frozen chicken to Angola. This vast southern African country is buying frozen chicken from Britain, yet it has untapped potential to produce enough poultry for local consumption and export.
Families across Angola will shortly be tucking into delicious, wholesome chicken from Northern Ireland.
Johnson seeks Britain's renewed engagement with Africa while he has been quoted as saying colonialism in Africa should never have ended. An article written by the Prime Minister while he was a Tory MP reveals he also downplayed Britain's role in the slave trade.
So far, Britain has inked post-Brexit trade deals with 13 African countries. For more on how Brexit has impacted on Africa, we contacted Mr. Africa Kiza, a development anthropologist and a trade policy analyst at the Southern and Eastern Africa Trade Information and Negotiations Institute in Uganda. Now, Mr. Kiza, after Brexit, are we going to see Britain moving to exert its economic influence in Africa?
Now, with Britain ceasing to be part of the EU, the only solution on how it can maintain its firm grip, its imperialistic grip on its former colonies, is through negotiating the same unfair free trade agreements with the same rigged rules and double standards with the countries of Africa and actually even the Caribbean and the Pacific. So I can see Britain maintaining stance on ensuring that these free trade agreements promote its continued access to cheap raw materials, continued access to liberalized markets for its finished manufactured commodities to access African markets. So I keep seeing Britain pushing for the same unfair trade policies and economic policies in Africa.
Well, you have it there. Britain will continue pushing its unfair trade policies on African countries. Last December, Britain signed an economic partnership agreement with Kenya, which was worth £1.4 billion in 2019. Now, the deal was signed in London by Britain's International Trade Minister and Kenya's Cabinet Secretary for Trade.
In our estimation, if we were to even capture 5% of the UK market, of the goods that we produce and export, in our estimation, our exports could be more than 3 trillion in a very, very short time.
Mr. Kiza, now do you think Britain's trade deals with individual African countries will undermine regional economic blocs?
Take an example of the East African Community. Under the Common Market Protocol and under the treaty establishing the East African Community, we are supposed to negotiate free trade agreements with third parties as one single entity, as one bloc. But the current move by Britain to negotiate, to cherry pick, it is more of divide and rule. It is looking for Kenya, which is more vulnerable because Kenya is a middle-income country, and it will cease accessing Britain's market at duty-free, quota-free, and it knows that Kenya will start having a lot of revenue losses when its goods to Britain start attracting high tariffs. When you look at the report of the Sector Council on Trade and Investment and Finance for 2020, which was held in September 2020, we wrote to the envoy of Britain asking that we should negotiate the FTA with Britain as one single entity because we are a customs union and we have one common external tariff. Britain rejected.
Before Kenya concluded bilateral trade agreement with Britain, it had already started talks for a similar agreement with the United States, a move that was criticized by the African Union. The immediate former Secretary General of the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, Makisa Kitui, has said that Kenya should consider going with the rest of the continent to the negotiation table with the United States.
So I would have thought that I would give priority to collective negotiation for enhancement of our goal. If it fails, then I can say, can we try to do something on the retail market? Because if you negotiate with the rest of Africa, you have more muscle in dealing with the Commerce Department in Washington than if you go as one country.
Mr. Akiza, you gave an example of how Britain is pursuing a divide and rule approach in trade agreements, and this is wrecking the East African community. Now, the United States also appears to be reading from the same script as Britain. Now, as you know, trading within the African Continental Free Trade Area started on the 1st of January 2021. Now, do you think this nascent agreement will fall prey to the divisive approach by Western countries in Africa?
The challenge here is that the Britain deals with African countries, risk undermining policy space, but also preferential arrangements under the African Continental Free Trade Area, especially if we grant more trade preferences to Britain than to what we will grant to ourselves, respectively, under the African Continental Free Trade Area. So it would have been better for Britain to adhere to the advice of the African ministers on trade, who had called for African member states to cease negotiating reciprocal free trade agreements with third parties until we have fully ratified and implemented the AfCFTA.
When Boris Johnson announced his plans to make Britain Africa's investment partner of choice post-Brexit, he was well aware that he has to contend with China's power in Africa.
Because I appreciate, as I say, that there is no shortage of governments out there touting for your business. China, I must mention the competition, but I better, why not? China.
Is Britain's renewed interest in Africa aimed at undermining China's influence in Africa?
Politicians often refer to China as our Chinese friends. So that narrative has deeply entrenched itself in the economic aspects and in the economic doctrines of Africa. And for Britain to break, the only way for Britain to break that link, that strong link, that continued growing link, is through pursuing its own economic interests. And Britain has a game here, because when you look at East African communities' exports to Europe, to EU, Britain alone accounts for 32.6% of those exports. So we realize that Britain knows that it is a big market for unfortunately primary commodities coming from East African community countries like Kenya.
Mr. Akiza there says that Britain wants to create a stalemate in Sino-African relations. Now, that appears to be an insurmountable task. Now, how can African countries secure their interests and avoid falling prey of lopsided economic deals with the European Union, Britain, and other world powers?
Now, the only way of gaining independence from foreign influence, especially in accepting unfair economic terms, including trade free and unfair free trade agreements, is through ensuring that we finance our own development budgets as African countries, which we should often present before the interested parties like Britain. Should Britain seek to have negotiating free trade agreements with Africa, we should present our own text.
Well, there you have it. African countries need to finance their own budgets instead of relying on Western donors. They also need to draw up their own terms and conditions before engaging in trade negotiations. Here at Africa Today, we shall keep you posted on trade issues affecting the African continent. And with that, we come to the end of our show today. Thanks a lot for watching, and do let us know what you think through our social media handle. On behalf of the entire Africa Today team, goodbye for now.